Hey, I'm scared. I'm really, really scared. I'm so frightened, as a matter of fact, that I went up in the attic over this long weekend. I think I mentioned my daughter Molly was home from school for a quick fall break. And I guess because of her presence and her immersion right now in the academic world, I started thinking about something that I read and wrote about, oh my God, 1,000 years ago when I was a student. No, I wasn't in my early 20s. It was a time when I went to North Carolina State. And I had a course in comparative religion and a course in English. And one of our assignments was to read Yeats's poem, The Second Coming. And this was in 1970. And things were not looking very good globally. Nixon was president. The slaughter in Southeast Asia was continuing. The civil rights movement was just in chaos. Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated. Dr. King had been assassinated. Malcolm X had been assassinated. An attempt on the life of the former governor of Alabama was made. It was a grim time. It was a scary time. And it wasn't that long after the Cuban Missile Crisis. As a matter of fact, it was only 8 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So our classroom instructor, and I don't think she was a professor, I think she was a teaching assistant. And she said, I'm going to assign everybody to read Yeats's poem, The Second Coming. And then I want you to write a brief summary of what the poet was saying. So with Molly here and our discussion shifting around, as it will when you're with a young student, the conversation shifting around to topics that I try to avoid. And those are the topics of destruction and Armageddon. I know I talk about it on this program, but I try to stay away from it the rest of the time. Because after a while, thinking and talking about this will start to unbalance whatever sense of balance you might feel you have. You know what I'm saying? Of course you do. So we talked about a few things, Molly and me, and she talked about a few things with her mother, things that were not quite as heavy, you might say. And then when the conversation drifted, some of Molly's friends came over, whatever, I went up to the attic and I started digging around, trying to find what I had written, the notes I had taken. And the paper, the actual paper, wasn't very long. The TA said to keep it to, under 300, 400 words. So I need to share this with you now. First of all, the poem, The Second Coming. And second, some things I wrote decades and decades ago. All right? All right. The Second Coming. Now, this was written in 1919, so that gives you an idea of what was going on globally. II had recently ended, and the stage was being set for World War II. With the Treaty of Versailles. The globe was still involved in millions of people dying of the flu pandemic. In Europe, there was an entire lost generation. Millions of men had been killed in this fighting in World War I. It was horrifying. In that context, Yeats wrote this. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction. while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all around it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again. But now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born? Now, every time I have read that, and I've read it often over the course of my life, it never fails to give me a deep foreboding, a deep chill, which is exactly what the poet intended. But the notes that I took, and I wanted to find the actual paper. I think I found it, and I started reading. I thought, no, this must have been the first draft or something. But the notes that I took were, first of all, the obvious, flying around and around in a widening spiral. A falcon can't hear the call of its owner. And things are breaking down, and foundations are crumbling. And then he talks about pure destruction and lawlessness have spread everywhere. And so has this tidal wave darkened by blood. When he says the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. Oh, my God. And the reference is that all the rituals of innocence have been swallowed, drowned in this tide of blood. And the best people aren't motivated to do anything, but the worst, and think about this one, this was so present to me in 1970, but think about it now. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Oh my God, think what's going on, which I'm going to get to in a moment in the current political climate. And then he alludes to some kind of revelation, not revolution, but revelation has to happen. And being steeped in Christian garbage, he comes to the conclusion, cynically, that the second coming must be close. And that's when the person speaking in the poem, whether it's Yeats or someone else, exclaims, "The second coming! Surely the second coming is at hand." And then the next line, "The second coming!" exclamation point. Oh, joy! But just as he says this, a vision pops up from or about the world's collective consciousness, or the unconscious. The person speaking in the poem sees this desert where, what is it, the Sphinx? But a creature with a man's head and a lion's body is coming to life. And he says, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun. Blank and pitiless as the sun. Its legs are moving slowly. Yeats says it's moving its slow thighs. And all around it are these shapes of disturbed desert birds. I mean, all of a sudden, this Sphinx, or whatever it is starting to move. Then everything becomes dark again. When he says the darkness drops again, everything becomes dark again. But all of a sudden, the person speaking in the poem knows something new. 2,000 years of calm, since the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, have been horribly disrupted by the shaking of a cradle. That's what Ye says. 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. The rocking cradle perhaps being the earth. And then the speaker and the poet asks the question, what beast whose time has finally come? What rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born? I mean, that's some scary shit. You know, this description of human beings' loss, our continued loss in control, and this tendency toward anarchy, and in our age, fascism and violence. Did you see the video of was it a young Hispanic kid who was eating a hamburger, and the cop comes up and opens the door and shoots the kid, and the kid's on life support now? I mean, and the kid was holding a hamburger, and it was obvious. And in the poem, these images, no matter how hard you try to stick with the literal writing of the poem, the images of this unsettling atmosphere, and you get the sense that we're living in this world of destruction. And the prediction, the summary, of course, that I came up with, and I think anybody who reads this poem can come up with, the prediction is that time is up for humanity. I mean, it's over. After World War I and the hideous pandemic and the slaughter and the killing that was going on, and not just in World War I, in the Far East, all sorts of slaughter and atrocities were being committed. And the message is civilization as we know it is about to come to pieces. Now, granted, Yeats wrote this in a very horrific time in the history of all of us. The end of World War I, which was not the end of death. The death continued. And 20 years later, with the invasion of Poland, it started all over again. But this sense that I got from reading the poem, and no matter how many times I read it, is that there's a world that Yeats is describing that's right on the brink of destruction. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. As you know, we've switched formats and are now broadcast exclusively on the Progressive Voices Network. So that means you get fewer program interruptions, no corporate commercials, and lots of profanity. But our format change also means some of our radio listeners no longer hear the program. It's been a while since I mentioned our podcasts, so you may have forgotten that there is a way to listen to this program anytime you need a good dose of screaming. Visit MikeMalloy.com and subscribe to our podcasts. As a podcast subscriber, you can download the program to your mobile device and take me with you wherever you go. And if you have a friend who needs a dose of truth-seeking, you can give a gift subscription as well. That's MikeMalloy.com, and never miss a minute of the uncensored fun and frivolity.